Street apologist. Street apologist. Street apologist. Street apologist. Street apologist. Street apologist. On the radio.
What's up, y'all? This is Vocab Malone. This is something we have not done yet on the channel. It's an interview, but it's not live. Almost all the interviews we do are live, but we're still going to get to you, the listener, the viewer, by asking Dr. Rana some of your questions. Dr. Rana from Reasons to Believe is the guest today on this very special interview on Street Apologist, Humans 2.0. That's the name of the book. And the topic is transhumanism. Dr. Fazale Rana is a vice president of research and apologetics at Reasons to Believe. Great organization. Check him out. We've had Hugh Ross on before. I'll put that link in the description. He is the author of several groundbreaking books, including Who Was Adam?, Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell's Design, and Dinosaur Blood in the Age of the Earth. He holds a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. And I asked him before the show began if he is a Cincinnati Reds fan, and the answer was yes. Welcome to Street Apologist, Dr. Fazale Rana. How you doing?
Hey, Vocab. Thanks for having me, man.
It was probably almost 10 years ago. I don't know exactly. I'd have to go back and look in the files that we hung out together in downtown Phoenix on a first Friday.
Yeah, I remember that. That was fun. Hung out in the art district, as I remember.
That was cool. And what we did was, you gave a talk on the cell and how it has an artistic, intelligent design. An excellent talk, by the way. And you gave the talk. And while you were doing that, we contracted a believer who was a professional artist. And he did on the iPad a highly detailed drawing inspired by what you were saying. So it was literally a melding of art and apologetics. And then that drawing that he was doing was projected outside on the front of the building while literally thousands of people were going by. He was sketching this out, and then people could hear and see the audio to what you were doing on the outside. Now, I know you didn't see all that because you were, of course, on the inside, so you only got actually part of the experience. And when he was finished, this piece was actually quite phenomenal. It was a man standing in what looked like a giant galaxy in front of him, but when you look at the drawing closer, it was actually he was standing inside of the cell. It was really cool. And so you're a good sport to do something kind of different and unique there at Downtown First Friday in Phoenix, and I thought you did a great job.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a lot of fun. I remember that fondly. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that memory back.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I am very grateful to RTB. They sent me this book, Humans 2.0. It's a cover right there. It's a pretty gorgeous book, actually. I like the way the cover is. I like the tactile aspect to it. I like this a lot. Brand new, very current, very, very relevant. Humans, scientific, philosophical, and theological perspectives on transhumanism, Humans 2.0. And of course, we also want to give shout out, love, props to your author, your fellow author, Dr. Kenneth Samples. Shout out to that, brother. Well, Dr. Rana, what is transhumanism?
Yeah, well, I'm discovering that a lot of people are not familiar with transhumanism, or if they are, they think of it primarily in the context of science fiction. In a nutshell, it's this idea that as human beings, we have a moral obligation to use science and technology to modify our biological makeup as human beings with the eye towards improving our flawed designs, making us smarter, stronger, more psychologically well-adjusted, taking control of our own evolution, if you will, with an eye towards some noble purposes, trying to mitigate pain and suffering and to try to promote human flourishing, but also with the hope that maybe we could use ultimately science and technology to create some kind of utopian type of future, and in the process attain some kind of practical immortality by extending our life expectancies to be indefinite. And so in many respects, transhumanism is an idea that is fueled by science and technology, but there are very strong philosophical and even religious components to transhumanism. And for me as a Christian, I see transhumanism as representing an alternative gospel where it's science and technology that ultimately is the mode for our salvation.
So we can become the masters of our own fate and, in a sense, the crafters of our own salvation.
Yes, that's exactly right. So that in contrast to Christianity, again, it's going to be the science and technology we develop that is going to rescue us as a species, but also as individuals, as opposed to the person of Christ, who is the source of our salvation as Christians. And I think people are going to find this idea rather appealing, even though, again, we think about this in the context of science fiction. It really is going to be a reality that will be upon us because of advances in biotechnology and in bioengineering and biomedicine very, very quickly. But it's going to be a rather appealing gospel because we have so much respect in our world today for science and what science has accomplished and will accomplish in the future. We turn to science to solve our problems. So why not turn to science to solve the ultimate problem we face, which is our mortality?
Well, Dr. Rana, can we talk about some of those recent advances? Now, I'm worried this could become literally the whole show because there's a lot to discuss here, but as brief and as accurate as you can, because we want people to see this as a reality. What's been going on?
Yeah. Well, to me, we focus on three areas in the book in science and technology that we think are areas that there's a legitimate progress being made that could be used as stepping stones to fulfilling the transhumanist vision. One of them are the incredible advances that are happening in gene editing, thanks to a new technology called CRISPR gene editing. And the idea is that this technology could be used to go in with high precision and modify the genetic makeup of any organism, including human beings. And so people are looking to use this as a way to treat genetic disorders and maybe even to cure people of certain genetic disorders, or if applied at the embryo stage, could even eliminate gene orders from the human gene pool if applied systematically. So people are excited about this for biomedical purposes, but this same technology could also be used to alter our genetic makeup in such a way to try to enhance our strength, our intelligence, or our psychological well-being, and therefore it could become a tool that could be used to serve the transhumanist vision. Another area of advance is computer-brain interfaces. These are incredible breakthroughs in engineering where researchers have designed these interfaces that can either rest on top of the skull or be implanted on the surface of the brain or embedded in the brain, with the idea that the patient can learn with their thoughts to control through the computer-brain interface.
Now, can I stop you there real quick? So is this true? I heard that right now in places in Asia, you can actually buy a headset that connects to a TV where you change the channels by thinking about what channel you want to change. Have you heard about that, or is that possible?
Well, I've not heard about that specifically, but I firmly believe that it is actually possible because, again, of these computer-brain interfaces, where there's been a number of pilot studies showing that patients can use their thoughts to control computer software and hardware. So why not change a TV channel, or they can control robotic limbs or exoskeletons. And again, this is going to be very important medical technology for treating people that are locked in because of a brain injury or a stroke, or people that are quadriplegics or paraplegics or amputees could make incredibly good use of this technology to improve the quality of their lives. But this is also now opening up the opportunity that human beings could become essentially a conglomeration of biology and machine, or that we might even be able to begin to affect actions in remote locations from around the world, or we could even do things like tethering our brains together with these computer-brain interfaces.
So that something actually like the Borg from Star Trek, when the last thing you said, tethering our brains together, Are you going the direction of like all the way we could have a hive mind, a collective mind, or do you mean something on a much smaller scale?
It actually could be both. For example, people like Michio Kaku are proposing something called the brain net, which replaces the internet, where we would interface or interact with each other through the computer brain interfaces, where I could convey my thoughts to you in a remote location just simply by, again, the use of computer brain interfaces. Or
what was his name again?
Michio Kaku. He's
God bless you. God bless you.
Yeah. He's a, yeah, right.
No, but I'm sorry. I just was setting up a dumb joke. So I heard this too, and I got to tell you. So I mentioned this before the show. I just listened to some different lectures on the serious and also on the silly side, kind of a variety. You know, I didn't go into the academic journals or anything like that, although I did go through various parts of the book. And a man was speaking of the possibility of something you just said. Is this also possibly true? He was talking about soldiers who would be able to communicate strictly on the field of battle to each other with their thoughts with certain equipment. So you couldn't, the enemy couldn't detect it. Is that a possibility?
Yes, it is. And there's been some really provocative studies done that seem to suggest that is a real possibility. There's a classic study done with two human test subjects in remote locations where they both have computer brain interfaces, and they're both playing in remote locations the same video game, and so they're seeing the same screen. And one person has access to the joystick that they can control with their fingers. The other patient is watching what's happening and then is thinking what he would like to do with the joystick, and could actually cause the other test subject to involuntarily engage the joystick. So here's an example where the two minds now are becoming tethered together. And so again, people like Michio Kaku, who, is saying that the brain net will replace the internet someday, or Elon Musk has just formed a company called Neuralink, where again, the idea is to try to create this kind of a framework where, that not only can we communicate our thoughts, but I can communicate my experiences in my sensations to you, and you could do the same thing for me. And so again, when you start thinking about coupling that with internet technology, it gives social media a completely different, meaning, I guess, in a sense where we're not just simply seeing what's going on in each other's lives through Facebook or Twitter, but we actually are physically and mentally experiencing other people's experiences.
So Facebook could become Mind Book.
Yes, okay. Something crazy like that.
It's funny, when I was a kid, and actually still, even though I'm not a kid anymore, I was a fan of G.I. Joe, the comics, cartoons, all that. And in there was a set of twins called Tomax and Zaymot. They worked for Cobra Commander, whose mask is right behind me right there. And they had what sometimes is sort of an urban legend, from what I understand, sort of a psychic link, where they would be almost like one was a GPS for the other, and you could hurt one and the other one would feel the pain. It's almost like you're saying something like that is possible with technology.
Yes. And again, it's something that, isn't upon us in the immediate now, but given the kinds of breakthroughs that are happening and how rapidly these breakthroughs are happening, this is a reality that is very, very much on our doorstep. And so you can begin to see how somebody who's a transhumanist could look at this and say, this idea of Kurzweil's singularity, where one day we would upload our minds into a machine and then live indefinitely in that context, is something that doesn't seem as far-fetched as we might think it would be. Now, as a Christian, I believe that there is an immaterial aspect to our nature, and that our mind is not equivalent to our brain. So from my worldview perspective, I don't think that we're ever going to achieve that.
Right.
But if somebody is operating from a materialistic worldview where our brain and our mind are one, are the same thing, or the mind is an emergent property from the brain, that kind of worldview and those kind of advances give hope to this idea that maybe one day we will be able to upload our essence, into some kind of machine, framework.
Yeah, almost every atheist I speak with, when you ask them about the mind body problem, at least these days, especially the college student guys, almost always refer to the mind as an emergent property. And I could see how someone operating on that philosophical presupposition, or maybe you might say physical presupposition, but that assumption could have that hope that you simply keep the software and replace the hardware in a way, is it kind of looks like what they could be thinking. And so that's interesting, because could it be the case that some of this we would achieve because of what you're saying, but there's some things that we might never achieve, but holding out the hope of it in and of itself could become a false gospel for those who do share those presuppositions.
That's exactly right. I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly right. It's not so much what we can achieve, but it really is what people think we might be able to achieve. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're going to put their hope in.
Right. And that's excellent. And that's why, seriously, you guys, if you watch this channel and show regularly, I deal a lot with urban apologetics. But if you sort of look at things I was involved with before, you saw that we covered all kinds of things. I have great interest, and I'm so glad that RTB sent this book to me to let me see what was going on with this, because that is why this book is so essential. Because even if some of this just sounds like crazy talk, and some of it does sound like crazy talk, it's true. The thing is that people talking about it, smart people thinking about it, is in and itself important for us to understand it. This book, it's just one of the most fresh, current books. Like I'm reading and I'm like, man, it seems like they literally just wrote this. Like the way everything in here. And the funny thing is, I bet even since you wrote it, there's more stuff that's happened. But this is a phenomenal resource. There's not a lot of books on this subject from a Christian perspective. There are some books on biotechnology that I've seen and bioethics, but this is a really unique, important book. And I recommend this book because Dr. Rana and Ken, you guys are balanced. And that's very important, because I see a lot of kind of unhinged, even conspiracy theory stuff on the internet. And this is very important to bring balance to the conversation. So I just want to thank you for this book. Where can people get it? Tell all the places people can get it. Maybe give a shout out to the website and stuff, because I want to make sure they don't get lost in the sauce and they pick this up.
Sure. One place people can get a copy of the book is reasons.org. The other place would be amazon.com. And through Amazon, you can get a Kindle version of the book. Through Reasons to Believe and through our website at reasons.org, you can only get a physical copy of the book. So if you want a Kindle copy, Amazon is where you want to go.
Awesome. That's awesome. Back real quick, and then in a little bit here, not just yet, but in a few minutes, I want to transition to some of our listener submitted questions. And we got some great ones. Going back to G.I. Joe, excuse me. In the 2009 movie, which wasn't all that good, there's a part where they give him these things called accelerator suits. And the a guy who's a new recruit says, "What's it accelerate?" And the guy says, "It accelerates you." And you mentioned exoskeletons, and it made me think of that. It made me think of Iron Man, which he's also mentioned in his book. Relating to that, is it true there's a secret arms race to create a super soldier among some of the countries, and they've got contracts out for this stuff for people to develop the tech? Is that true? Could we see an accelerator suit just like in G.I. Joe? Could we see Iron Man on the battlefield? Is that possible?
Well, I really don't know the answer to that question, but let's put it this way. DARPA in maybe the 1950s or 1960s was actually investing quite a bit of money in trying to develop exoskeletons. Now, at that time, the technology would allow them to develop exoskeletons that could be used to increase or enhance the strength of the person wearing it quite substantially, but the weight of the suit itself was so enormous that it was really impractical. But since then, the technology has progressed rather significantly to the point where people are looking at seriously using some kind of exoskeleton technology to allow people that are immobile to gain mobility. And of course, if that's the case, then you're just steps away from utilizing that for military purposes or other types of purposes that may not be military related. In fact, I was in Lima, Peru about a couple of years ago now, and I met a Christian who was an engineer and had his own company, and they were trying to develop exoskeletons where they were looking at using them for construction and things like that, other purposes.
Right.
But he and I had an interesting conversation just about, is this something that a Christian should be pursuing or not? And so it was we're looking at, again, this being part of our future sooner rather than later.
Well, is this transhumanism something a Christian should be pursuing? I know that's a big loaded question, but it gives you a chance to talk about transhumanism and Christianity, because we do need to hear that laid out, and I think it's a good spot.
Well, the challenge here is that these technologies in and of themselves, in just simply in a biomedical context, are very exciting technologies that could literally improve the quality of so many people's lives. And as Christians, that's the type of thing that we want to see happening.
Right.
That's consistent with our mission as Christians. But even then, there's a lot of ethical questions that arise strictly in a biomedical context.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's going to be very tempting to see this technology being used for enhancements. But when we look at our history as a species, we have used technology to enhance ourselves, to improve the quality of our lives. The difference here is that this is now where the technology is literally permanently modifying our makeup, our biological makeup. And that's where it's going to be different. But inherently, I don't see a problem with limited human enhancements, but I get the sense that there is probably a line that we shouldn't cross, and exactly where that line is, I frankly don't know. But this is part of the complexity of this, is that this technology can be used for so much good. It can be misused, it can be misapplied. And if it is misused and misapplied in certain ways, it could actually not generate a utopian type of reality, but maybe something that's dystopian that we really wouldn't want. So I guess my point would be, as Christians, we want to be cautiously optimistic about how the technology is used. We want to be vigilant, but we also want to have a credible voice that allows us to participate in the conversations about what technologies we will pursue and how we should pursue them, so that we are ensuring that they're going to be used in the best possible way. If we are not intelligent about how we engage transhumanism, or we're unwilling to engage it as Christians, we are capitulating the future to people who don't share our worldview, and that to me is really concerning. But also, I see another significant reason to be interested in transhumanism, and that is, I do think that there is some overlap between the transhumanist vision and the gospel.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you continue that right there. But he's going now. A lot of what we discussed is in the book, and he's about to go into another chapter in the book. But let me show you some of the things we've already discussed from the book. I'll give people a sense of it, and then we'll continue on that, which is going to be chapter 10. Chapter 1, gene editing and the prospects for human enhancement. Chapter 2, neuroprosthetics. What a word, right? Just think about that. Brain-computer interfaces and the prospect of a cybernetics future. Chapter 3, anti-aging technology. Chapter 4, ethical challenges of human enhancement technology. Chapter 5, secular bioethics and their limitations. Chapter 6, the case for the image of God. Chapter 7, the image of God, foundations of Christian bioethics. And then, of course, what is transhumanism, the problem with progress. And now we come to discuss something and laid out in chapter 10, transhumanism and the gospel. Speak on it.
Well, it's very easy to think about, a transhumanist future where people wonder, is the gospel even relevant in that type of future? We talked about transhumanism maybe being a legitimate alternative to the gospel. But when you think about it, what transhumanism is offering people is a world where there is minimal pain and suffering, where humans, where there's progress, where it's a striving for some kind of utopia.
It's almost trying to reverse the fall through technology, although they wouldn't put it in those terms, but trying to reverse aspects of the fall with tech.
Exactly. That's an excellent way of putting it.
Yes.
That's very insightful. But also there's this recognition that as human beings, death is unnatural.
Right.
Death is the enemy. It's something that we need to conquer. There's a recognition that, particularly if you hold to a materialistic, atheistic worldview, that there is no ultimate meaning or purpose or hope or destiny for us as individuals or for the human species. And so what transhumanism offers is genuine hope, I think, to people that hold to a materialistic worldview. And so these are the very same things that the gospel offers us. And that is an end to pain and suffering, a world that is a utopian world, but it offers us also the means by which death is overcome.
Right.
And it's not just simply immortality that we're offered, but it's also eternal life, which means that we are in a relationship for eternity with our Creator, which is an incredible, incredible offer.
Amen.
But the point is that what transhumanism is doing is laying bare the very real need that every human being has for what the gospel offers. And this is going to make the gospel incredibly relevant, I think, in a future that on the surface, you wouldn't think that the gospel has anything to contribute. And so as Christians, we need to be able to articulate the gospel and to recognize just really the cry of the human heart that is represented by what transhumanists are trying to achieve. And so to me, I have a lot of compassion for transhumanists because of that. And I think what my critique of transhumanism would be, ultimately, it's incredibly naive to think that technology is going to ever deliver us from the predicament that we're in,
right,
for a number of reasons.
I mean, even if you could enhance life indefinitely, in some ways that could almost perpetuate or create something akin to a living hell. I mean, who if you think about, there's some people we would not want to live forever, but it doesn't mean they wouldn't have access to this technology. But it's like the last chapter is resurrection, the ultimate transformation. And what you're kind of getting at is that what the gospel gives us through Jesus Christ and the cross on Calvary, transhumanism can promise to give us that same thing with a stack of chips and a server in Silicon Valley. But it's a false promise ultimately. It doesn't mean nothing good will come out of some of this, is what I hear you saying, which again, I appreciate the balance. But also we have to say, what's the end goal here? What are people trying to achieve? And sounds like one of the goals is to get to a place where we can describe ourselves as post-human. We haven't talked about that word yet, but I find that phrase and concept utterly fascinating. Could you break down post-human?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is in a sense part of the transhumanist vision, that we would take control of our own evolution and really modify ourselves as a human species, correcting the flaws that the evolutionary paradigm has yielded. And that in the net result is that we very well could alter ourselves to such a degree that what ends up resulting is not what we would recognize as a human being anymore, but really a post-human species that we have created by our own hand, by our own efforts.
Right.
And
go ahead.
Yeah. So that's kind of the part of the transhumanist vision. Now, one of the ironies of that is something that a number of philosophers have pointed out as critics of transhumanism, is something called the salvation paradox. And that is that if we actually achieve the transhumanist vision, what we wind up saving will not actually be ourselves, but something else, something that we have created. And so in our attempt to save ourselves through transhumanism, we actually may end up driving ourselves to extinction. We may create our own extinction.
He who seeks to save his life will lose it.
Yes, very right. Very nice.
So that's interesting. Before Christopher Hitchens had passed, I heard him, and to those who don't know, he was considered one of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse in the early 2000s, and that somewhat continues on. Christopher Hitchens spoke in regards to humanity's ultimate demise, a heat death or a collision, some place where the monopoly board gets reset, something like that. And he says, well, I don't know about all that, but if we look up and we see, the sun about to go out for the final time or something, he said it more artfully. He said, it won't be us looking up. Now, this is a paraphrase, but he was saying that at that point in our human evolution, we'll have self-guided and self-directed our human evolution up to the point that will be something else looking up at that last moment. But he looked at that, the way he was describing, as something beautiful, poetic, and majestic. And I heard another transhumanist advocate, I forget the man's name at this time, they asked him, do you believe in God, or does God exist? And the man said, not yet. Not yet. Is that impulse in transhumanism? It sounds like you're saying yes. If so, how can there be a Christian transhumanist?
Yeah, well, this is something that was new to me, but I, uncovered as I was doing the work on the book, and that there are Christians who see the transhumanism as the way in which God is going to attain kind of our immortality as human beings. And so they see that we have a role to play in terms of participating with God in our own redemption through developing this technology. But the argument would be that that's part of God's plan, and that's how God is ultimately going to attain, what we see promised us in Scripture. And, to me, I think that I would agree that, again, as Christians who want to extend the influence of the kingdom of God, the technology that is fueling transhumanism could be used for wonderful ends, but that technology is going to be limited in terms of what it can ultimately achieve in terms of our future. It's not a future that we create that really is the promise, but rather it's a future that will be given to us when Christ returns.
Amen.
And so that's where I would depart company with a Christian transhumanist is, yeah, I would agree that we should foster the development of technology and use it towards, again, redemptive ends, if you will. But ultimately, it's the advent of Christ a second time that is going to usher in really the promise of the gospel.
Now I think is a perfect time there, Dr. Rana, because you've done an excellent job at making a complex subject understandable. I think this is sort of introductory. We try to make it fun, but it's really introductory. Really, to understand more, you got to get the book, Humans 2.0, brand new, and just a powerful, awesome, insightful book that is utterly relevant. Let's transition now into listener questions. I've got a few great folks who commented because I said, hey, what questions do you have for Dr. Rana? And I love some of these questions. So let's take a look. Here's one from Liza, and she says this is more for you to comment on. As a former Mormon, I see similarities with transhumanism and the Mormons' belief that humans have the ability to develop supernatural abilities, become immortal, to become God. What say you about that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question and very insightful. And I do know that there are a growing number of Mormons who are embracing kind of a form of transhumanism.
They have annual meetings. I watched some of their lectures online.
Yes, and so the transhumanism is very appealing to Mormons and does fit in with their theology. So yeah, we're going to see some interesting bedfellows as transhumanism gains a footing in our popular culture.
Fascinating. Someone asks, in relationship, we'll continue on with listener submitted questions, in relationship to the cover, I'm still thinking about the robot hand on the cover. Does transhumanism involve the replacing of body parts with robotic parts for the purposes of longevity?
Yes. The short answer to that is yes. And, in a sense, when we talked about a post-human future, the vision of many transhumanists is that there's not going to be a single post-human species, but really a collection of post-human species that are going to represent different conglomerations of our biology with technology. Some post-humans may be genetically enhanced. Others may be enhanced with computer hardware and software. Others may be even a combination of those things. So it's not going to be, according to transhumanists, a single post-human species, but really an ensemble that reflect different applications of different types of technologies.
So much of this discussion makes me keep on thinking of Cyborg in the DC universe, of the Justice League. some of his abilities, where he can immediately access sort of the internet with his mind, stuff like that. And that brings me to bring up something about this book that I think our listeners and viewers will find really, really cool. Each chapter begins with a comic book story arc or discussing some quotes from different comic series, and then relates it directly to transhumanism, a relevant aspect of the chapter. I thought that was fascinating how you did that. And I asked you before the show, and you said, well, I'm a fan, and we thought it would be a good idea. And it's funny because someone wants to know, on a lighter note, is Dr. Rana a Captain America fan?
Well, I am a Captain America fan. And, both Captain America and, in a sense, Iron Man are actually both, in a sense, excellent examples of transhumanism, really. Where Captain America was the super soldier serum that he took.
Yep.
Whereas with Iron Man, it's the technology that he's building, through his engineering expertise as Tony Stark. But both of them are excellent examples of transhumanism. We ended up focusing on Iron Man in the book just to have a little bit of fun, but also because one of the things that I find interesting about Marvel Comics is that they really are taking on some pretty significant issues in the pages of comics. And with Iron Man, much of the issues that they take on relate to our relationship with technology. And a lot of the questions that they address are questions that emerge as a result of thinking through what would it look like if we began to alter our biology with technology. And so, in a sense, things like the Iron Man comics or Captain America comics are actually helping us to probably jumpstart the conversation about the ethical concerns with transhumanism. Science fiction and fantasy have been a wonderful arena where these ideas have been explored already. And so we now have, I think, a greater sophistication as we approach a transhumanist future because of literature. That we are, sensitized to, the types of questions and concerns that we should have. So go ahead.
Well, it's just this funny thing, when we start having to craft laws for this, I can see politicians being like, we need to talk to someone who's been thinking about this for a while. They're going to call up the comic book writers. You guys have been writing this, bro. Help us out. I don't know if that really happened, but maybe they'll call you. Maybe they'll call you. Well, it's funny because I think we have quite some bright listeners, and they actually asked some questions related to that very thing, meaning these issues being explored through various media and pop culture. Of course, a classic example was Brave New World. But here's a question from the Foil Guy 777. He says, isn't there a risk that there will be a society, a world where people are discriminated based on DNA, like the movie Gattaca? That's what Foil Guy asked about Gattaca. So is that a risk?
Oh yeah. And people that are looking at the ethical concerns related to, enhancement technologies as well as transhumanism are really concerned that we may create a world of technology haves and have-nots, or, and that there are questions about who will get access to the technology, and is it most likely going to be people that have already socioeconomic advantages, and they'll get access to the technology and in turn have even greater advantages, and you kind of set in place this vicious cycle that very quickly stratifies society. Or you very well could easily see somebody being discriminated against because they choose against enhancing themselves,
right?
And people that choose to have enhancements are viewed as being superior. Or if we start talking about trying to eliminate certain genetic disorders from the human gene pool, are we going to be entering into some kind of high-tech eugenics where the discrimination now is not against somebody because of their ethnic background, but because of whether or not they have a particular disease or not? And are we going to lead to a future where we devalue human life, particularly with people that, again, suffer from some kind of disease or injury or disorder? So the prospects of abuse are really, really very frightening. And it's one of those things where it's very easy to see a society drifting into this kind of a future, particularly if the technology is progressing faster than we can deliberate about it ethically.
Which seems to already be happening in China, from what I've been able to read. So that's not just alarmist. That's a very real thing. In relationship to something you just mentioned, Jennifer asks, can you explain the differences between transhumanism and eugenics?
Yeah, well, in a sense, again, a very perceptive question, because I think most people who are transhumanists would probably reject eugenics, but in effect, you cannot escape some form of eugenics when you start thinking about a transhumanism future, particularly if you're trying to attain, enhancements through genetic engineering, through designing the genomes of individuals, because you're going to try to then design certain properties out of the genome and design certain properties into the genome. And that, in a sense, is really a version of eugenics light when you start thinking about doing those things. So very perceptive that in effect, one kind of leads to the other in many respects. It's hard to disentangle the two, though
Right.
transhumanists I think would very much, reject the prospects of eugenics. I don't think they have a choice,
Right.
but to really own it.
Oh boy. LJ says there's a book, and I guess it's a movie too, with Tom Hanks, called Cloud Atlas, and wants you to react to this. In that situation, there's a world where there are subhumans and advanced humans, and their lot in life, their destiny, was based upon their genetic and biological makeup. It seems like you've indicated from some stuff you said previously that this could be the case.
Yeah, well, one of the things we haven't talked about much at this point is the development of anti-aging technology.
Right.
And, the thought is that we very well could extend human life expectancy into the range of hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, just simply through anti-aging technology, independent of all the other stuff that we've been talking about. And, if that happens, you're now going to be looking at a future where, everybody is not going to be able to have children. If people are living for vast periods of time, you're going to have to reduce the birth rate in order to have a world that's sustainable. But that also means then that you're going to, when you replace people in that world, you're going to want to replace people with certain skill sets. So in other words, you could easily see a world where we do have designer humans, and that we are going to design humans to take a particular role in society. And as a consequence of that, their lot or their place or their status in society is going to be determined by the way in which we engineer that particular individual.
So like a genetic caste system?
Yes, something like that. You could easily see that type of a future, particularly if we're looking at, extended life expectancies and, dramatically reduced birth rates, where, again, we would want to kind of dial in the type of people that we would need in the future, if, again, we went down that kind of a path. And this all sounds very science fiction-y, but
Right.
I mean, we're stepping stones away from this technology really being available and being confronted with these kinds of decisions.
In relationship to that, a listener, Boricua from New York, says, would all transhumans be genetically engineered and reproduced in a lab?
Well, right now, I mean, you could have people that are genetically designed, but still they would be, they would be born just like any other person would be born, where you would be doing the gene editing at the embryo stage and then planting the embryos into a surrogate that would carry the embryos to full term. Now, there are people working on artificial womb technologies where, in principle, you could have the entire course of growth and development taking place in an artificial womb prior to birth. But the technology there is far, far lagging behind. So in the near future, if people are looking at designer babies, it's going to be, where they would be carried in a mother's womb before birth.
In the end of the book, you actually have two places that you refer to as special focus: artificial intelligence in the post-human world, and artificial wombs in the post-human world, as well as an appendix, a primer on molecular biology. Man, oh man. A few more listener questions, because I think they did a fantastic job. Here we have PR from Queens says, would a transhuman have a greater, lesser, or unchanged capacity for evil than humans do now? So that's an interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. And, this is something that we didn't touch on extensively in the book, but there are people who believe that through pharmaceutical agents, or maybe through even gene engineering, we might be able to alter an individual's psychological makeup, their psychological well-being. We might be able to influence their personality. And so you could easily see, again, with the transhumanist type of technology, attempts to try to engineer out the evil tendencies that people have, or to try to engineer in, quote unquote, what we would call good tendencies, which now means somebody has to make a decision what is morally right and morally wrong. And again, if we think that this is kind of absurd, there have been a number of studies showing, for example, that in prisons, prisoners who have committed violent crimes tend to have certain genetic fingerprints related to the proteins in cell membranes that bind that are neuroreceptors. And so people think that there very well could be a tendency for committing violent acts that are actually dictated by our genetic makeup.
Right. That's what the idea of like Skinner's biological determinism. If you have that presupposition, then.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, and so does that mean that we're going to go in and try to genetically engineer people so that they have a different type of neuroreceptor, or different types of neuroreceptors so that they behave certain ways? So you can begin to see, how, again, this technology can even be used to try to influence the way that we view right and wrong as a culture.
We could genetically modify out of the human gene pool homophobia, for example. Somebody might say that. I'm saying somebody might say that from their own worldview or their perspective. They may say that's a value. This is interesting because I heard a transhumanist say, in essence, that what we could do is write the code for these transhumans that would enable them, for example, to down to their genetic level, be able to keep the 10 Commandments. And this could be actually part of God's way to enable the human species to become more sanctified.
Yes. Now, of course, there's also certain, philosophical presuppositions in place when you make those kind of statements where you're stripping people of free will. You're saying that there's only a material aspect to our psychology and our behaviors, which again I would reject as a Christian. But again, depending on your worldview and how you understand the nature of humanity, you are going to look at, what is possible very differently. But the science there's enough science that's there that is really very tantalizing for somebody that is a transhumanist.
The last serious question, Dr. Rana, from Foil Guy 77 again. How much of transhumanism research is based around Nietzsche's Supermen? And maybe he doesn't just mean research, but sort of the thought surrounding it and the philosophical, underpinnings, that kind of thing. But could you talk about that? I thought that was an interesting, insightful question as well.
Yeah, and I'm not completely sure I get. It's a great question. I'm not completely sure I get fully where the questioner is coming from, but maybe this will help. And that is ultimately the transhumanist vision is birthed out of the Enlightenment.
Okay.
Which is the idea that science and technology is going to be the way that we ultimately rescue humanity from the predicament that we're in. It's going to drive progress. It's going to be the way that we solve all of the problems that confront us. It's going to be the way that we improve the world around us. And there is this sense among transhumanists that we are inherently flawed and that
Right.
that those flaws have to be corrected, and they can be corrected with technology. And so what we're striving for is this ideal of someone's conception that we're trying to create through science and technology. And again, it's largely viewed it's largely advocated from an atheistic worldview.
Do you see some kind of rough analogy? Maybe if not, it's okay. Between all of this and say Genesis 11, I believe is the chapter. The plains of Shinar and the Tower of Babel to sort of reach God, reach the heavens in the sense of deify ourselves through tech. Do you see some kind of maybe a rough analogy? Like if you wanted to preach a sermon on this, could you say,
Yeah, well, I definitely do, because I mean, it even goes back to what happened in the Garden of Eden, where the ultimate rebellion against God was in such a way that Adam and Eve were trying to take God's place. They were trying
have
to
his knowledge.
Right. And you see that also with the Tower of Babel. It's trying to take God's place. And so in many respects, you could see the part of the transhumanist vision as really constituting that idea that we're going to take God's place. Now, I actually am of the opinion that as human beings, it's okay for us to play God because we're made in God's image, and we've been granted certain responsibilities because we're image bearers. So when we create as human beings, we are manifesting God's image, and so in that sense, we're playing God. But to me, the issue is are we trying to take God's place?
Yeah.
And so that's really, when it comes to, how is the technology that's being developed going to be used? And if we could say, well, we're trying to use the technology in a way in which we play God, but we're doing it to God's glory and in accordance to, what we see God's will, wonderful use of the technology. But if we're using the technology with the mindset we're trying to take God's place, that's where I think we all become rightfully very uneasy about what the future could look like if that becomes the mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I could see how we could say some of this is in line with what some theologians, I would agree in general, depending on how you apply it, with what's called the cultural or the dominion mandate in Genesis, the earth and subdue it. You could see that. And even, sort of do good to all people. So you brought up the example in the book of Misty Knight. She's in a Daredevil universe, to those who don't know. She loses her arm and gets a replacement arm, in which, it essentially makes her a better cop in the sense of she has a more powerful arm. That in real life, it would seem very difficult to argue against that from any kind of Christian worldview or really of any kind of moral structure I could think of. But that seems decidedly different than a story, I believe, that you mentioned of a man who gene edited himself. And you mentioned how maybe people get drunk and instead of getting a tattoo like, people do now, they go and gene edit themselves, which I found a fascinating prospect.
Yeah, well, and this is, you're referring to Josiah Zahner. And this is something that, really factors into the complexity of this issue, making it even more complex, is that to me, my concern isn't so much with what Josiah Zahner would call the academic elites or the scientific elites who are developing these technologies and looking for ways more or less to use them responsibly. The challenge is that these technologies are becoming so powerful and so easy to use and so inexpensive that it's giving rise to these biology do-it-yourself movements, where you have, like, you can go on Amazon, believe it or not, and order a CRISPR gene editing kit for under $200 and have it delivered to your house the next day, and that evening do gene editing experiments on your kitchen counter. Now, these are pretty benign types of experiments, but that just illustrates how easy this technology is to use and how inexpensive. And so it's going to be very easy for people to start setting up their own gene editing operations.
This is like genetic moonshine.
Exactly. It is.
You're from Virginia, so you know all about that.
I know exactly about that. And so that's the real concern is, are you going to have these pop-up organizations that provide gene editing services, either responsibly or irresponsibly? Are you going to have certain governments in the world seeing this as a golden opportunity for economic growth, establishing kind of a form of genetic tourism, where people are going to get this kind of gene editing done? And so this is adding a whole dimension to the complexity of the issue, is because of the accessibility of the technology and this idea that this technology really belongs to everybody, not just the intellectual or the scientific elites, but everybody should have access to the technology, and we should have the right to do with the technology whatever we want. And there's a very strong sense of autonomy that undergirds transhumanism.
Right. Again, as Spock would say, fascinating. And I guess to the brothers and sisters in the audience, I should be a little more specific. Dr. Rana originally was from West Virginia. I just said Virginia. That makes even more sense of the genetic moonshine comment. Now, this is the last question, and it's a not so serious question from one of my favorites, Nate, aka Nate 2D2. He asks you this. Are you prepared? How many transhumans does it take to screw in a light bulb?
I really don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I've been thinking about this, and I think I have an answer. None. Certain transhumans are the light bulb.
There we go.
They genetically modify themselves and incorporate bioluminescence. And the next thing you know, their fingers shining like E.T.
Yeah, there we go.
Elliot. That's a lot of pop culture references for a show on transhumanism, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, utterly fascinating stuff. Very important. We got to think through the current issues in a biblically sound way. Humans 2.0 will assist and equip God's people to do that. So I want to thank you, Dr. Rana, for your contribution. And shout out again to Dr. Sample. Shout out to the Street Apologist Live listeners who typed in such excellent questions. Sorry I didn't get to them all. And Dr. Rana, you have the final words, my friend.
Well, I think at the end of the day, and I'm speaking at this point to my brothers and sisters who are Christians, that, what we have to do as Christians is really look for ways to engage our culture, regardless of what the issue is, that we can't adopt a position of ignoring what's going on in our culture. We can't adopt a position where we're condemning everything. But what we want to do is adopt a posture of thoughtfully engaging our culture, trying to find those things in our culture that have redemptive value, but also find ways in which we can build a bridge between what's going on in our culture and the gospel. And,
yeah.
and it's easier to do than you would think, because the gospel is, I think, relevant regardless of what's happening in the culture. The gospel always has something important to say. Has something of ultimate importance to say. And so we just want to be, again, equip ourselves to use every opportunity we can to communicate to people the truth of the Christian faith and the gospel hope.
Excellent. Well, with that, Street Apologist, Vocab Malone, that's me, with Dr. Rana of RTB is over and out.
Street Apologist. Street Apologist.